got a medical issue and she wasn't allowed to fly. So she's extremely sorry about that and really would have liked to come. But the organizers promised her that her paper will be introduced here, and you had, I understand, access to it, pre-circulated. So if you want to comment later on her paper or talk about her paper, you are free to do that. Actually very welcome. If she would get some feedback as well, then she cannot respond to what the commentator will have to say here. So you know much more about the format than I do, but as I understand, we will have first three commentators introducing the paper. So we will go in the sequence of Mike Morgan, Sarah Snyder, and Jens Giesecke, and then we will have responses by Arjo and by Rina, right? And with regard to introducing this large group of people here, I mean, obviously you all have the bios, but I just try to get a few highlights from everybody's bio here. Let's start with the commentators. Mike Morgan. I know that he got his PhD from Yale, and now he is assistant professor of history at Trinity College at the University of Toronto, and before that he was an assistant professor at the U.S. Naval War College in Newport. Then we will have Sarah Snyder, who is a lecturer in international history at University College in London and did her PhD from Georgetown. And then we will have Jens Giesecke, whom you already know from the afternoon panel, who's the head of the Department Kommunismus und Gesellschaft am Center für zeithistorische Forschung in Potsdam, Center for Contemporary History in Potsdam, and he's a specialist on Stasi and everything related to that. And then we will have Arjo Mako, who is a visiting doctoral student at the University of Oxford, and he works on 20th century international history, with particularly focus on Scandinavia, and this is also a topic of his paper. And finally, we'll have Rina Kula, who I once met in Belgrade, and she worked on the non-aligned movement, and we figured that out too. And she is now at the University of Jyväskylä in Finland and working as a professor for modern history of Europe and international relations. And her monograph about the non-alignment, which is supposed to be a very interesting one, has come out with Macmillan, and I'm looking forward to see that at some point. All right, so we are starting now with Mike Morgan. Understand the commentators have about 5 to 7 minutes, and the response are about the same. So how about you start introducing the FIPEDALU table?
Yes, thanks. So I'm in the unique position, I think, of introducing the paper of a presenter who can't be with us. So I will pull my punches a little bit, well, because she's not here to defend herself. I'm kidding. I have really just some interesting questions to raise for further discussion for Effie. And I hope she'll have a chance to engage with our discussion here and respond in due course. So what I intend to do is just give a brief summary of her paper, her main argument, and then make a couple of comments and raise some questions for our own discussion and for Effie and time. Her paper focuses on an interesting episode in the history of NATO in the early 1980s and poses a key question about the aftermath of NATO's 1979 dual-track decision. Why was it, in the aftermath of this decision, that two of NATO's smaller members, I use the term small advisedly here, smaller members, Denmark and Greece, why did they dissent from the alliance's position toward the Soviet Union and insist on adding footnotes expressing that dissent to the alliance's communiques? That's the main question she seeks to answer here. There is, as she describes it, some conventional wisdom on this point, and her goal is to challenge this conventional wisdom. The orthodox opinion, let's say, is that Denmark dissented because of short-term political considerations, because of instability within the Danish government and within Danish public opinion, and that the Danish Prime Minister and his cabinet felt that they couldn't actively go along with NATO's position for fear of losing domestic support. In the Greek case, Greek dissent was a result, again, of short-term considerations, short-term ambivalences towards NATO in the aftermath of the end of the dictatorship, which ended in 1974. In response to this orthodox position, I don't think Effie uses the term orthodox, but we can call it that for the sake of simplicity, she argues that we need to take a longer-term perspective to understand the Danish and Greek decisions, and to look at why, over the preceding 20 years, there was a growing sense of insecurity and a declining sense of trust in these two countries vis-a-vis the Atlantic Alliance. What were the sources of this declining trust and growing insecurity? She points to a few different factors. The American shift to strategy of flexible response in the 1960s, which both the Danes and the Greeks had serious doubts about. The Americanization of the Vietnam War, which drew American attention and resources away from Europe and raised concerns among the Western European allies that the United States was less committed than it had been to the military defense of Western Europe. Growing Soviet naval presence in the Arctic and in the Mediterranean, which put pressure on these two flank allies, raising their sense of exposure to the Soviet military threat. And the rise of détente, which, again, I guess in Copenhagen and Athens, posed questions about how committed the United States really was to working with its Western European partners, and raised the prospect of a U.S.-Soviet condominium that would bypass the Atlantic allies. So these factors put together created over a 20-year period, let's say, a real growing sense of insecurity for the Danes and for the Greeks. And this vulnerability was particularly acute because of their absolute reliance on the United States for their security. As small countries on the flanks of NATO with small militaries of their own, they needed American support and an American security commitment for their own security. So in light of this evidence, what they saw as evidence of growing American unreliability, they decided that they had to take measures to mitigate their insecurity and reduce their vulnerability. So, for example, the Danes banned the permanent stationing of foreign troops on their soil. They would not allow Western nuclear weapons on their territory. And Greece took measures to defend unilaterally its own security, even at the expense of raising tensions with the NATO allies. And so in this context, in this longer-term perspective, the footnotes in the aftermath of the dual-track decision are just the latest expression of this sense of vulnerability on the Danes and the Greeks' part. I think that's a pretty good encapsulation of the question that she raises and the thesis that she offers in her paper. To raise a comment and a few questions about this for our own consideration, I think this story, which admittedly is a pretty small episode in the history of NATO, if you take a step back and think of the whole history of NATO and the Cold War, raises some interesting questions about the way that the Atlantic Alliance worked as a whole and relations between the Western European states and the United States. And it points to maybe a new kind of confidence that I'm not sure if we've talked about yet over the last couple of days. And this is confidence that one can betray one's allies without consequence. To the United States, I think, the Danish and Greek dissent from NATO's policies in the early 1980s was a kind of betrayal, or could be interpreted as a kind of betrayal. But the paper suggests that the Danes and the Greeks knew that they could engage in this behavior without cost because they had confidence that their relationship with the United States and with the alliance would endure despite this dissent. So this, I think, adds a new layer of complexity to our understanding of what confidence was during the Cold War and how it operated. A few questions to raise for discussion here. The first has to do with this theme that we've been engaging of substantive versus public trust, dissent, politicking, rhetoric, and so on. And this is the question, did the Danish and Greek dissent from NATO's policies reflect a real loss of trust in the alliance, or was it a public show of a public act of non-confidence for the sake of domestic public opinion? Maybe it was both. And I think it's a question worth evaluating to what extent the spectacle of the NATO summits influenced, or the idea that public opinion would be watching these NATO summits affected Greek and Danish decision making? How do we assess the extent to which they were doing this for the sake of appearances versus as a real substantive point of disagreement? The next question is, why did the Danes and the Greeks dissent only with footnotes? This is a pretty minor way of dissenting on such a major issue. When nuclear destruction hangs in the balance, or the threat of East-West conflict, simply registering your reservations with a couple of footnotes on some communiques seems to me a pretty soft way of expressing concern about a pretty major policy. So from the American point of view, registering dissent at all was a pretty serious matter. But seen from the Danish and Greek perspective, if they were genuinely concerned that this policy raised the threat of nuclear war, why did they take such soft measures to register their disagreement? The allied question to this is, what did they hope to gain from registering their disagreement in this way? And the last question I would raise is, how do we put this experience of two of NATO's smaller members, who are typically, I think, neglected, and I want to credit the paper for paying attention to two states that I think are often unfairly neglected. How do we understand their experiences in the context, or how do their experiences compare with the experiences of other smaller NATO allies over the course of the Cold War, and this rather ambivalent relationship that smaller states could have with their superpower sponsors? Is this part of a broader pattern, or should we understand this as an exception to a broader pattern? How do we put, in other words, this single episode into a broader context? So I'll leave it there and hope that those questions can generate some fruitful discussion. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
I would just say as a comment on Mike's comment that although in this context perhaps the footnotes seem to be a soft response there, I think we know as academics that there can be incredibly brutal footnotes. And so perhaps we should be careful about suggesting that this is a mild and meek response. So,
fair enough.
I'll just move this forward a little bit. So in the spirit of, I think, the way this discussion was structured, that we would present someone else's paper in order to encourage more discussion, I'm not going to spend a lot of time summarizing the paper with the assumption that people have read it, and instead have sort of a slew of questions for you and for others to consider. Just briefly, I'll say that Arjo's paper is very much framed by debates that took place in Sweden after the end of the Cold War about the nature of Swedish neutrality, and specifically, had Sweden secretly been a 17th member of NATO? This was the sort of charge that was bandied about in the aftermath of the end of the Cold War. And it really addresses two different sort of contexts of trust in Sweden's development of foreign policy and international relations. First, it's about the character and development of Swedish neutrality itself, and specifically Sweden's efforts to convince the United States, the Soviet Union, and their respective allies of its commitment to neutrality. And this is the sort of international level of trust building that he's looking at. And then the other second aspect of this is the trust or mistrust between the Swedish government and the Swedish people about the formulation and character of this neutrality. The first thing that I would begin by saying is a question to Arjo that I've been facing, and many others are as well, but to perhaps in the context of the keynote addresses and the discussions we've had thus far, to think perhaps more critically about the use of the term trust, both in how you define the term, but also in how Swedes at the time used it during the Cold War and after, and if those are different conceptions. And I started off thinking about this because I wondered if the term trust was really appropriate in the way you used it in relationship to understanding why multiple Swedish governments withheld a much more complicated picture of Swedish neutrality from the Swedish people. And I wondered why the government saw the Swedish people and Swedish opposition politicians as untrustworthy, and what it was about them that was untrustworthy. Is it their judgment, this sort of that we were talking about last night? Is it their discretion? sort of, so what is it about them that is untrustworthy? And then if we take this contention to be true, that the Swedish government did not trust their own people and Swedish opposition politicians, I wonder what would trusting them have looked like? Would there have been an open discussion of the actions that the government was taking that was actually undermining Swedish neutrality to some degree? Because it seems like that actually wasn't possible due to the international constraints that Swedish politicians saw on the formulation of their foreign policy in their attempts to maintain neutrality. So I'm just sort of interested in hearing more about that relationship. I'm also interested in hearing more about this distinction that you make between inward and outward trust, and specifically about the mechanisms by which this trust was distributed on the domestic level. And again, this is going back a bit to the relationship between the government and the people, because I feel like there's quite a disconnect between the government's public rhetoric about neutrality and obviously what they're doing privately, what their understandings of Swedish neutrality really are. One of the things that was interesting to me was that Swedish politicians in your paper are so concerned with demonstrating neutrality, specifically to the Soviet Union, that they won't allow any questioning of this policy to take place, that there can essentially be no domestic debate about Swedish foreign policy because they're concerned about being seen as untrustworthy neutrals to the Soviet Union. And so I'm interested in all of this sort of interplay of who is trustworthy and how somehow to demonstrate your trust, you must have a unified position in which there can be none of this sort of normal give and take that we would think would be expected in a this type of political system. And I was particularly concerned, I guess, and if I had been Swede, I can understand why this was so controversial at the end of the Cold War, about the extent to which there was this disconnect between what was happening on the international level publicly that Sweden was doing and the extent to which they were pursuing a very different policy secretly to be seen as being less than neutral by the United States and its allies to ensure that the United States would act to defend their neutrality. So I did find this quite complicated. In addition, I was interested in how these debates might have been informed by domestic politics and the extent to which the closing down of debate may not have been only about conveying a certain picture to the Soviet Union, but that it might also have been tied very much to domestic political debates, which isn't something that you had space to get into in the paper. And then also you talked about how this was very much a function of the early Cold War period, and that by the time that Sweden gets into the second half of the Cold War, that neutrality is no longer questioned to the same degree. And I was wondering why that happened. If there had just been an effective silencing of critics with this sort of contention that anyone who questioned neutrality wasn't trustworthy, or if a real consensus had developed around this policy, that the Swedish people were now uniformly supportive of being neutral. And then I guess related to that, what would the consequences have been during the Cold War if the more sort of complicated picture of actual Swedish neutrality had come out? What would have been the domestic political consequences and perhaps what might have been the effect on Sweden's role internationally? And then in terms of the outward trust that you talk about, I was wondering how much it is that Swedish ministers are really concerned with developing trust versus fostering confidence. And I'll return to this. Well, actually, you know what? Maybe I'll just, now that in my mind it's connected, I'll move to it. I think that this idea of this submarine insults is a fascinating story because it suggests that the Soviet Union did not actually trust Swedish neutrality, and that the Swedes didn't have confidence that the Swedes were respecting their neutrality. I mean, it's not completely clear to me how much there were actual submarines versus these were sort of phantom Tonkin Gulf-esque sightings. but I think that both sides of it suggest that actually trust in Swedish neutrality had not been established. And so I wonder perhaps if about this question between developing trust or fostering confidence. I do think that the submarines insults is a great section, but I think it has to be linked much more explicitly to this broader discussion of trust and Swedish neutrality policy that you have. Going further with this question of Swedish-Soviet relations, I wondered, you argue that the Swedish government was able to earn Soviet confidence through rhetorical commitment to neutrality as well as through concessions. And I wonder if Sweden was able to sort of take this to the next step. Did it win Soviet trust? Did the Soviet Union trust it, or did it just believe that it would remain neutral? And perhaps what the differences between that might be. I was also really interested in the two examples that you presented, both the case of the refugees at the Swedish embassy in Santiago and also the minister who was fired over the CSCE third basket negotiations, in which it seems as though this focus on secrecy and a very limited space in which Swedish foreign policy can be discussed really inhibited the pursuit of a coherent Soviet foreign policy. That's my own tendency to constantly be talking about the Soviet Union. The extent to which this was an impediment to successful Swedish foreign policy. And so if you could talk a bit more about this emphasis on secrecy and also expand on these two incidents, because I think they sound quite interesting, but they're not addressed in great detail in your paper right now. And I was particularly interested in sort of the refugees in the embassies, given my own interest in the Pentecostal families who are in the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. And then this is sort of going a bit beyond trust into the emotional component that you talk about in your conclusion when you say that emotions do have a history and that they matter. But I didn't yet see a really deep engagement with the feelings or emotions of the historical figures under discussion in your paper. And I would like to hear much more about these key historical actors, their conceptions of neutrality and their values. You know, how does it fit with them that they are misrepresenting their foreign policy abroad and that they're misrepresenting it to their public, as well as the idea that some people come into office and are even misled about what Swedish foreign policy really is. So I am very interested in how they rationalize this, what their conceptions of the role of secrecy in government are, et cetera. So I really wanted to have more of the people of your story fleshed out. And just connected with that, perhaps you might also, because to me it seemed that some of this was very Kissinger-esque, and generally when you have the secrecy in the Nixon-Kissinger period, there's a sense that it's somehow un-American, that it might not fit with this idea of an open democracy. And so I was wondering if perhaps it's acceptable because there's a longer tradition of secrecy in Swedish foreign policy, and so perhaps you could put this in a broader historical context. Maybe it's not just a Cold War emphasis on neutrality, but has a longer history. But I thought it was an incredibly interesting paper that just raised lots and lots of questions for me. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And finally, Jens.
Yeah, I got the pleasure to present Rinja Kulla's paper on neutrality and its varieties in the Finnish case, which in a sense can be read together or as a counterpart to the Ajo's paper on Sweden. And, for example, Yugoslavia on the other hand is mentioned in the paper. Rinna, in general, wants to challenge the view that Finland was only a convenient location for cross-block talks, but played a more active role, I would say, based on its specific policy of what she calls neutralism. And I would want to focus three main arguments here. First, the concept of the very concept of Finland's foreign policy of neutralism. The second, on the Finnish role within the communities of countries which were not assigned to one of the two blocks. And thirdly, on Finnish neutralism as a basis for an active role in the détente process. So the first argument goes that in reaction to the Soviet pressure in the early post-war years, Finland developed a number of principles to save its sovereignty and minimize risks of an integration into the Soviet bloc by force. These principles included commitments to accept the role of acting factually as a cordon sanitaire, no interference into Soviet domestic policy and policy towards Eastern Europe. For example, in the cases of the interventions in 1956 in Hungary and 1968 in Czechoslovakia, limited relations with West European and Atlantic institutions, refraining from military and security alliances of both sides, limited cooperation with Western intelligence, and allowing a domestic communist party, which of course is not a specific of a neutral country. You've got a lot of communist parties in Western Europe as well. So these commitments resulted into a position which she calls neutralism, which has to be seen in difference to neutrality, when I get it right. So as a result of these principles, Finland at last omitted to get involved into the what we can call third bloc of the Cold War, the movement of non-aligned countries. Although in a number of issues, the position of Finland was quite similar to that of, say, Yugoslavia or Egypt. The basic idea behind that was that Finland tried to keep quiet on a number of sensitive political issues and criticism voiced by the non-alignment movements against the superpowers, like, for instance, anti-colonialism, questions of democratization, etc. Thus, as Finland rejected to join the Warsaw Pact earlier, it rejected the invitation to join the non-alignment movement in 1964 as well. So, to my third point, taking all this, you can argue that Walter Laqueur was quite right with his pejorative notion of Finlandization as an expression of what he called reduced sovereignty and overly chicken-hearted policy towards the Soviet Union. But Rinja argues that, on the other hand, this policy of neutralism and the pretty tight relationship with Moscow was an important basis for the early initiatives of President Kekkonen for one or another form of détente policy as early as the 60s. From 1963 onwards, Kekkonen launched new initiatives for a more important role of Europe in the Cold War and, of course, Finland. He conducted bilateral talks for a more active role with a number of European countries. He took an initiative for the nuclear-free zone over whole Scandinavia, which was of course, an important point due to the very different statuses of the several Nordic states. He took the Finnish position as a lever for cross-bloc negotiations, including the question of on-site inspections of Soviet nuclear arsenals, which proved to be always a delicate point. And finally, he promoted the general idea that negotiations are of value as such in Cold War confrontation. So these initiatives were established and later on were used as a starting point for Finland to function as a venue for the CSCE based on the close relationship with the USSR, which causes some trust in the process on the Soviet side. To quote the, I would say, pivotal passage of Rinna's paper, quote, in the case of Finland, one can argue that with détente, its policy of neutralism began to use trust as an analytic category of a foreign policy strategy. The working dialogue with Moscow was utilized to build the Helsinki Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe and the Helsinki process in the 1970s, unquote. So for further discussions, I got 3 points. First of all, I got a more personal, if you want, German request to Rinna on her interpretation of West German Ostpolitik as a kind of neutralism. I don't know if you had the chance to discuss that with Egon Bahr, for example, but I'm sure he would be upset about this interpretation because he didn't, of course, conceptualize Ostpolitik as neutralism at all. Secondly, more general, the paper in Sweden opened the floor for a much wider discussion on the varieties of neutrality and neutralism and their respective roles in the Cold War. And thirdly, the third point, of course, is in which respect we can cover these relationships with the term trust, which is not a very new idea. I would totally agree that in the 60s, Finland's policy was important for confidence-building processes between the blocs, but it needs more investigation whether you can treat the very asymmetric relationship between Finland and the USSR under the term trust or even confidence. Thank
you. Good. Well, thank you, everybody. I think particularly Arjo got a quite heavy load, right, of questions from Sarah. So you have 5 to 7 minutes, let's say 7 to 8. So
yes, I'll try my best. First of all, the question of whether or why the employment of the concept of trust is justified. I think first of all, what was or seemed obvious to me in the beginning of looking at the subject was that it's been used explicitly in these spheres that I mentioned in the paper. On the one hand, I kept having older or retired students in my seminars, given the seminar about Swedish politics in global context since 1945, and they would kept saying, you know, this is such a disappointment. We were misled, and our trust was misled, and this was a lot double standard. And also the whole debate about the true nature of Swedish neutrality very much discusses democratic deficit, misuse of power, rather than realistic or foreign policy outcome. There's nobody complaining about the outcome of the foreign policy. There seems to be, even in the historical evaluation, consensus among most commentators that neutrality itself as a concept was, or as a strategy, was the right way, the right choice to make. But still, there is obviously there are emotions involved, and this goes back to a number of features that I tried to include in the paper. One, not only is it problematic because there was no real open debate, but also where you did have a forum for exchange, such as the Council of Foreign Affairs, where you had the government, opposition party leaders, and even the King of Sweden, actually. That was thought to be the forum where you would include the opposition in matters of national interest and national security. And the government did not include them. I think another significant problem here was that you had a prime minister who was 23 years in office, 1946 to 1969, and a very dominant foreign minister who also served 17 years. And their way of choosing this policy, defining it, and also transforming it into some kind of dogma that would not allow any kind of debate or criticism. And the fact that any kind of criticism would result in fierce attacks, fierce public attacks, or measures such as removing the leader of the opposition party from the delegation to the UN in 1959, or, more or less publicly crucifying the opposition leader in 1968 for criticizing the government's silence on the Prague Spring. These kind of things, in combination with the revealed far-reaching military and intelligence cooperation with the U.S., create some kind of feeling that a lot of commentators actually themselves put in terms of trust. So I would certainly agree to the need of working on the link between concept or concepts of trust and the way I utilize it in the paper. But I think since emotions are involved, there should be a way of justifying the use of the concept. When it comes to the outward dimension and the relations with the Soviet Union, or probably even with the US, yes, again, just like Mike Morgan mentioned earlier, you might be able to replace trust with confidence, and might even be more accurate when it's on that level. Another question was whether by the 1970s we see real consensus. I think yes, when we look at public debate and the voters, 2 decades almost of rather dogmatic foreign policy actually resulted in this national. This is what one scholar from Manchester University has argued. Can't recall her name. The constructed myth, because we have to realize that in the late 1940s, actually other options were considered as well, such as a Scandinavian Defense Union. So it was not a given choice in the beginning, but a few years later only, this could not even be put forward as an argument by anyone who would criticize the government for the policy carried out. So the public adopted this it has been called constructed myth of Swedish neutrality being a guaranteeing strategy for peace. But I don't think that was the fact on a political level. That is valid for diplomats such as Edelstam in Chile in 1973, or Talrot, who was the head of the Basket 3 negotiations. They actually disagreed with some of the features of this neutrality policy, because they would state that, well, we're always putting a lot of we always talk about solidarity and that we need to support greater justice, and we're talking about the third way of democratic socialism. So clearly, this is what we do, and as soon as they would cross a certain line defined by the government, you would see severe consequences once again. Both of them actually being removed from their positions, and that was because by the 70s you had very few people who really knew what was going on. I do mention new research that shows that there is some kind of disconnection happening, and by the late 70s and early 80s, not even the new prime minister really knows about the full extent of earlier military cooperation. So I think what is different maybe what between the Swedish case and others is how trust is being used explicitly, and how the ones that create this dogma say that anyone criticizing national consensus in foreign policy matters is untrustworthy. That's the term being used as well. And what does it mean? Well, to me, the problem is that they talk about national consensus, but actually it is national consensus should look at what the other side or critics think as well. But in this case, it's very few actors who define what the national consensus is, and they will not open the floor for any kind of debate. And they are the ones who define who is trustworthy and who isn't. But I agree that there is a difference between that kind of trust towards diplomats, politicians, and the one that they think they have to establish when it comes to the Soviet Union and even the US. So I will have to rethink the question of confidence versus trust when it comes to the outward dimension.
Thank you very much. And finally, Rina with some comments, responses.
Thank you. I think that your outline of my paper was much better than I could have delivered it myself, so that's a relief. Well, the first thing that I would like to say is that I think we often forget what the 1960s, late 1960s, early 1970s actually were like in Europe. they were not a time of easy questions. Think about it. In 1971, for example, there's the hijacking of a Scandinavian Airlines airplane in response to the Croatian Spring movement in Croatia. There are emigre groups who do, there are very violent, very public acts, not only with relation to question of Palestine and the Middle East, but European questions essentially. Should there be more liberalism in Yugoslavia? There are 2 bombings of Yugoslav Airlines offices in Sweden in 1971. So this time is quite also the time of radical politics and violence in specific acts. And I would like to start by somehow thinking about that also when we think about how does Kekkonen move from his foreign policy to thinking about détente. That's something that I think a lot about these days. And also to sort of to base my answer, Ostpolitik, I'm really glad you asked me that. That's actually something that I've been thinking about a lot. And my question would be, yes, I would probably, German history is not my specialty. When I read about Ostpolitics, it feels like home to me. Like it feels like it is the foreign policy of neutralism. But if you would have asked me this, let's say when Bernd first time met me in 2008, I would say absolutely nothing. It has nothing to do with this. This is a Finnish policy. And I have somehow now come to, after spending more time on it, writing a dissertation of it, my own mind has opened up more. And what happened when I actually prepared this paper was that I had my documents that I collected earlier on a hard drive, and I went through Finnish Foreign Ministry documents, and I could see that Kekkonen was talking about East Germany and Ostpolitik in his own thinking, and then it seemed natural to me. I also think that I was reading in the last 2 years many biographies, for example, of Joschka Fischer, so I had a different idea of what Bonn powers were. I had a better understanding of it. So for me, it seems quite natural, but I probably couldn't defend that in writing. But it is probably something that I would like to work on because it seems so obvious to me now. I think we should also remember that Willy Brandt was a very strong figure for many Scandinavian politicians, Olof Palme, others. And his influence and thinking is much deeper than we often recognize in Cold War historiography. I mean, Willy Brandt comes up in, let's say, overall histories of Europe, but we don't often think about 1960s or 70s in the sort of overall Cold War historiography as A, a very violent period in Europe, or B, as with some of these key figures like Brandt, really having an influence on people who become politicians or intellectual politicians in Europe, in Scandinavia. So that's what I would say. I also think that what's interesting is that Finland arrives at neutralism, foreign policy of neutralism, from a point of self-interest or a strategy, right? That's what I argue for, and that's what I think my documents show. But neutralism as a foreign policy in the late 1960s becomes to represent something else to Kekkonen, where he maybe, we could argue, that tries to utilize trust as a political capital, that he has some currency with the Soviet Union, maybe he can use it here. And I think that also it's possible to argue that Walter Lacour was right. Perhaps it's okay that he's right and Kekkonen is right, both at the same time. That you don't have to. The Soviet Union can have the intention of abusing Finland for its own good as long as Kekkonen doesn't allow it. Kekkonen can accept that, but argue for something else. And I think that his argument really was to have Europe be the forum where Euro-Atlantic relations would be resolved, because he saw the risks with, for example, missiles being placed in West Germany to be the highest. He wanted to have the forum for the dialogue not far away in Vietnam, but somewhere where the actual sort of front line was. Going back to maybe Effie's paper a little bit, something that I see, at least today we haven't talked about that yet, or it maybe is missing from the paper, is that after all, Greece and Denmark are incredibly different kind of countries. I believe for the reason that Denmark had joined NATO in 1949, yes. But all the Scandinavian countries, maybe with the exception of Iceland, and Finland was trying to join it, within the Nordic Council had created a kind of an identity of what the state is, whether the country was a NATO country like Denmark or Sweden that wasn't a NATO country. These countries speak the same language. Danish is a bit harder to understand when you hear it, not to me because I speak it, but to other people. But the idea was that, for example, Denmark had committed itself, at least in verbal discussions, not to have any more NATO bases and not to have any more sort of NATO politics. It wasn't a neutral country, and it didn't have a foreign policy of neutralism, but it had a identity of what the political space was that was quite cohesive with the other Nordic countries, with free education, with the sorts of type of system. And in the 60s, there's a moment where all these countries have a social democratic government. And most of those leaders were inspired by Willy Brandt. There are moments like that. And therefore, I think that Norway is just, it's a small NATO country, but it's very different from Greece at the end of the 1970s. Or maybe that paper could be used to argue that at that point, Norway is leaving a definition of what is Nordic welfare society, or what is the Nordic identity, maybe. But they are quite different in that way. In the beginning of the paper, I have some quite interesting quotes. My own interest in Finnish history, I was not trained as a Finnish historian. I was born in Finland and I speak Finnish, which is a very difficult language and in that way an asset coming to this topic. But I was trained as a historian of Yugoslavia and a historian of the Balkans. The reason why I arrived to these questions of Finnish neutrality or neutralism was that I wrote a PhD thesis about the Tito-Stalin split. And while I was in the archives in Belgrade, in the Yugoslav Foreign Ministry archive, I found a dialogue between Helsinki and Belgrade about Finnish foreign policy of neutralism, because in 1948, Yugoslavia splits with Stalin and the Soviet Union. And in that dialogue, there are many times the word trust is used. The Yugoslav ambassador in Helsinki writes that although the Finns, it should be emphasized that we succeeded in good measure in creating individual trust towards us from the side of the reliable Finnish government officials and political figures who in general can be characterized by aloofness and caution in making any remarks on delicate international questions. So there you see Kekkonen's line, if there are any questions about superpower politics, we don't comment. But the Yugoslav ambassador, after Stalin dies, this is in 1953, considered this an asset for him that, well, now the Finnish person is trusting me. However, to us, they gave some definite evaluations, and this is about how the Soviet Union will treat Yugoslavia after Stalin died. By developing friendly activity, we succeeded in producing intimate and informal relations in good measure, in that competent persons conversed with us with exceptional freedom, directly, and with noticeable amount of trust. So this is from the Yugoslav side, talking with the Finns about the Soviet Union, where the Finnish officials gave some, they say, you know, now the Soviet officials will come and talk to you more at receptions, and then maybe in 4 months they will try to normalize relations with you, and they tell the Yugoslavs, you should accept these overtures. Try not to respond with aloofness, but that it's better that you have diplomatic relations, more useful for you. So those are, in my own research, where I found the concept of trust, and why I have such a strong view that I think that it does have something to do, that the Finnish foreign officials and foreign policy understood that, or confidence as some kind of a political asset. I think that's enough.
Okay, thank you very much. We have about 32 minutes left for discussion. And I invite you to discuss all of the papers, including the one presented by Mike Morgan from FIPEDALU. So, who wants to open up the discussion? That's a surprise. Frau Freva, bitte. Okay.
Thanks to all of you. And the question goes to all of you. Since I'm not a scholar of international relations, I was struck by the notion of kind of equality between the various players on the international scene. I don't know who it was that introduced I think Jens, in commenting on Rinna's paper, this notion of asymmetrical relations between Finland and the Soviet Union, small country, large country. In a way, and that kind of kept me thinking about, again, confidence building measures and trust among people, and about the question to what degree actually is it possible to institutionalize or to establish relationships of mutual understanding, trust. Let's keep it there, among partners that are so different in their ability to harm each other. And if this game, let's call it a game that is played on these, in these summits, in these kind of diplomatic circles, in the meeting between diplomats and statesmen, etc., is somehow about concealing this asymmetry. And the notion of trust might be, just a guess here, something that I invite you to think about. If the notion is trust is a way of establishing on a semantic level relations of equality, of mutual acknowledgement and appreciation. We all in this world, and each vote counts, each person counts, each state counts. Although underneath we all know that these relations are completely asymmetric, and the ability, again, to harm and the vulnerability to being harmed is quite different. And the next, my general point is kind of connected to that. I keep on, throughout this conference, I tend to think much more of trust as a let's call it emotive, in the sense that William Reddy talks about emotives, something that is like a speech act, but it's not just a speech act. It's an emotionally loaded speech act. You quote it, you name it, you talk about it, and use it as a semantic tool, as a mechanism to ensure something that might not have anything to do with trust, but allows you to kind of reach a semantic level where you can wrap up things that can't be voiced in another language.
Would any of the two main speakers like to respond to that, Rinna, or?
I would like to, but you can go first.
Well, I mean, to be honest with you, the way the discussion develops makes me think about actually dropping the whole idea of applying the concept itself to the outward relations, because doubts probably justifiably have been raised about applying it to international relations between states or representative of states. And then I would reduce my paper to look at how the distribution of trust allows the Social Democrats to play out their cards and dominate Swedish politics, because I think their trust is more of it is easier to define it, to see it, and to prove it when it comes to this Council of Foreign Affairs, where you know that even the opposition has the right, so to say, to know what is going on other levels, such as military and secret cooperation, and they're not being told. Instead, the government creates this dogma, claims moral high ground, we are neutral, and playing back channels at the same time. then that I think is a safer way, so to say, to employ the concept and argue in favor of it. Because I would agree with what you say, that it would need further consideration when you apply to states or representatives of states, whether it really is the right concept to use, first of all, and whether it is just a thing that they say and talk about, or whether it really was relevant. So I'm still in the process of thinking there.
Yeah, I very much liked your comments, but I came away with a completely different conclusion than you. You know, my work has been on foreign policy documents, and it was much based on the fact that I speak 7 languages and I can go to all those archives. And since I had half a career in public policy and in diplomacy, it was easy for me to read diplomatic documents. Why? Because I've written them sometimes myself, and I thought that you understand that it's not truth-telling, but you would understand what does it mean to write a document for a specific purpose. Hence, not a lot of emotion in it, or emotion, but you understand how to read it. So for me, it's quite unusual, this type of topic about trust, but I agree with everything that you say, that trust has emotion in it. And on the other hand, if we don't look at the fact that I normally, someone in international relations history works with a lot of documents and with diplomatic sources, if we put all that aside and we think about, let's say, Finnish-Soviet relations, how could that not be emotional? Of course it's going to be emotional. There were 2 wars. There was with the Soviet Union, the Second World War. There's an 800-mile land border. Other country has time zones. Finland has 5 million people. That is going to be emotional no matter what. But I don't think that one cannot accept all of these things. There can be trust in asymmetrical relations, I think, and it is a game, but maybe if you accept that it's going to be asymmetrical, I don't see it really being a problem. I will have to really think about it a lot and test it out in writing, what does it look like. But maybe you're absolutely right, that maybe you do have to have meetings and gestures, because otherwise you're not acknowledged, and the vulnerability becomes just greater if you don't have that. The other thing I was thinking about, what is the difference between confidence and trust? I think the Finnish leaders, Paasikivi and Kekkonen, had trust that they had developed the best possible foreign policy out of a lot of bad options. I think they looked at the history of Soviet or Russian-Finnish foreign relations. They looked at the Second World War and were very upset with some of the choices made in that war. And then they looked at what Europe was going to look like after 1945, and they tried to come up with the best strategy that you could come up with. Now, if confidence is that you have confidence that you have come up with the right interpretation of a set of circumstances and the right strategy, you can call that confidence. But in such a complicated circumstances, isn't it, according to your lecture from yesterday, isn't it going to have to be trust? Because trust had that element of, not knowing if you're, not knowing if you're right or not knowing that you're wrong, you're somewhere in between there. So don't you then have to have trust? You can't. Confidence is that you're confident that you can make the best possible choice. But in very complicated set of circumstances, you cannot be sure of that. So I don't know. For me, that's how I would look at it here. And I think it's actually quite interesting. It's something new, and it could be something new about Cold War history.
Does anybody from the panel actually here wants to respond?
Just a short additional comment about the problem that I see there. I mean, did Olof Palme and Willy Brandt trust each other? Yes, I think so, on a personal level, and even in their convictions on international affairs. But did that lead them to put their national interest aside or heavily modify their foreign policy? I don't think so. At best, Palme and his administration would try not to get in the way of Bonn and the Ostpolitik. But their doubts about German reunification, for example, always prevailed. And they were very much interested in status quo politics in Europe, since they were interested in stability in Europe, and therefore also their revolutionary rhetorics in world politics, their outspoken criticism of the U.S. bombings in Vietnam, never transferred to the European sphere. There was no comparable criticism of the Soviet Union, and there was generally there was no readiness to take any risks because of the Ostpolitik, despite this I think prevalent personal trust between these two leaders.
Any other questions or comments from the floor?
Thank you very much. I'd like to raise an issue that, as it seems to me, concerns all four countries in question here. Or the question is, how much leeway did they have, or how much are we looking at an active or reactive policy here? On one hand, we had, of course, the very specific circumstances from which these countries or their governments started in a more fundamental way regarding Sweden and Finland, in a more specific way, a situation related on the case of Denmark and Greece. And two things seem to be obvious, or I have this impression, or the question of commitment, reliance, trust, reliance, regarding which community, which environment. It seems to me that starting from very various starting positions, they end up in I wouldn't say renationalizing of their policies, but the policies displayed here seem to look like finding a specific way out of that situation, whether being part of NATO or not, or having some kind of clandestine relationship with NATO or not, or the Soviet Union, where it was not clandestine, but everybody knew about that, of course. But still, seems to be remarkably little trust in actually the international community, or even that part of the community that one belonged to. It's rather, were they driven in a desperate way to resort to national solutions? I mean, it's not the final word on this, of course. They remained embedded, but it still looks like, from the impressions I had from the presentations, that there was exactly rather regressive policies, whether it's making up legends and myths for one's own justification of one's own policy, or reacting to get back to the first presentation, which we talked less about Denmark and Greece with this footnote approach. As you said, is it a soft or strong response to the situation? But in any case, it seems to be like why did they do it? To demonstrate something, to show some kind of, not independence, but that we are here, we are actors, something like that. And to whom, actually? And maybe you asked that question yourself, Michael. Why did they do it in the case of Greece and Denmark? Did they want to show something to their allies, to the Soviets, to whom? So very broad, foggy question, I know, but I wanted to raise that issue. Thank you very much.
Anybody here wanting to comment or respond to it?
Yeah, Finnish policy definitely reactionary to circumstances. Yes.
Well, I mean, Swedes in response to 1968, there are documents where the Social Democratic Party leadership realizes that there is a shift towards the left, and that we need to adopt more radical policy, or at least more radical rhetorics, and then. You have this criticism against the U.S. war in Vietnam, which secures them the sympathy of the younger generation. But at the same time, you still have this cooperation with the U.S. and also, I think you mentioned this confidence that you can pay this political cost. You can go out and demonstrate alongside North Vietnam's ambassador the way Palme did it, because he knew that this is a political price he can pay in balance with the domestic sphere that there is. On the other hand, 6 months later, during the Prague Spring, that is what I argue in a forthcoming article, he never even considered, because the setting of Swedish foreign policy, even the so-called Swedish active foreign policy, would not allow him to attack the Soviet Union the same way. And I also would argue that it is not, regardless of the number of victims, even if the Prague Spring would have caused much more casualties, the reaction towards it would have been very, very different from the reaction and the criticism against the U.S. And that somehow says a lot about the interplay between the domestic politics and foreign affairs and the different dynamics. But I'm still thinking that it seems to be a concept easier to employ when it's on a personal level, and it seems to be more about confidence, even if they in the Swedish language actually called it trust when it comes to the international level. And maybe the CSE is a little bit different because you did have this social dimension, at least to a certain extent.
Thanks. Actually, I would like to not so much go into the actual papers we are discussing now, but would like to further a bit the discussion about the point Ute Frevert was raising about the question of asymmetry, because I think we came across that quite many times, not only now that we are discussing concepts of neutrality and neutralism as a foreign policy concept, but also when we were talking about the dynamics within the blocs. And well, I think we are then we come very much into the field of symbolic actions and the symbolic meanings of actions. You said, I think, very correctly that how can we build up a trustful relation if one of the partners has not or has just limited means of harming the others, or but as we, for example, see it now with the European economic crisis, with Greece, for example, being the country that we are talking about. Yeah, but it is not. I mean, it is Greece, and everybody says, oh, well, Greece in the European Union and with the euro, what's going to happen if they are not there any longer? But it has, as we see now, a major impact because of its symbolic meaning. And what I also wanted to say with, and maybe there lies the way of like really vulnerability if we have a fragile system as the blocs during the Cold War. And another point I wanted to raise with regarding to the question of asymmetry is something that I have thought about a lot in my own work when I was dealing with American public diplomacy in West Germany from the 1960s to the 1980s. And I'm applying there the idea of leadership and partnership. And it is not, I think, necessarily so important to always give the impression that you are talking among equals. It can, if you can find an agreement and really agree on that there is some kind of hierarchy in your relationship, and that there is, for example, a hegemony in a bloc or in an alliance. That does not necessarily need to lower the chances of building up a trustful relationship. But I think it is very important to kind of keep a balance between those two ideas of leadership and partnership, to be a trustful leader and a trustful follower, so to say, or but still to be in a way in a partnership, no matter if this is like real equality or not. But I think those two ideas of leadership and partnership might be something that can help explain us the dynamics within the blocs, or when it comes to the relationships between the blocs and the countries that are not part of one of the blocs. So that was more of a comment, I think.
Any
Could I take advantage of my proximity to the microphone to offer one
didn't
thought
want me to
and
talk
speak out of turn? Obviously, I'm
You were encouraged to do so. Yeah, please, please.
Thanks. I think I'm breaking the rules here a little bit, but I think the theme that cuts through all three of these papers is precisely this question of asymmetry, and more specifically, in conditions of such stark asymmetry of power between the United States on the one hand and Greece, Denmark, Sweden, Finland on the other, or the Soviet Union and Finland on the other. In this context, how can small states exercise any influence? What is the basis for their influence? What are the elements of their power? Clearly not military. Militarily, these are states that are insignificant, I think, in the overall scheme of things. So what then, if they are insignificant, why does anyone pay attention to them? I think the source of their power comes from the threat of defection and the importance of the symbolism of unity, which means that their power, in some sense, has origins in the weight that people attach to symbols and to rhetoric, the idea of unity. It's not that the United States needs Danish military power on its side. Rather, the United States needs the Danes not to defect, because defection would shatter this illusion, this rhetorical or symbolic illusion of Western unity. And similarly, if you look at the Warsaw Pact side of things, it's not really that the Soviets need the East German military support. It's more that they need the East Germans not to make a fuss, not to dissent from the Warsaw Pact or the Soviet line on things, and they need the East Germans basically to stay on their side. So what that means is that superpowers can find themselves at the mercy of the weak, and smaller states like the East Germans, I think, found ways to use this power based on symbolism as a way of exerting leverage over their allies, the superpower allies, that by any objective sense have far greater power.
Oh, okay.
Along those lines, Andy Kidd, in his book on trust, has a rational choice model of what he calls a hegemonic trust, referring to the alliance. The fact that you have an alliance leader allows the other states to cooperate, whereas they might not have been able to cooperate if they hadn't, had the United States to provide collective goods and ensure that everyone's needs would be met. And another example of that would be public goods theory, the idea that you don't have cooperation among independent actors because there's a temptation to free ride, and the way you get cooperation is by having a hegemonic leader. So it doesn't seem like hegemony is incompatible with trust. In fact, if you have asymmetries, it might be necessary for trust. You have to have a leader. But as Reinhold was saying, there is a difference between being a leader and, I guess, being a, let's see, what's the word? It's not hegemon. Hegemon, being an imperialist power. And being a leader versus being the head of an empire.
Yes, I just wanted to suggest that there's perhaps even another option in the sort of structure that Mike has laid out of, say, in the Greece case is the one I'm most familiar with, that I think that the United States does care about them remaining on their side. Because at least by the 1960s with Greece, the threat is not that they would go to the Soviet side, but that they would be somewhere in the middle. The United States is incredibly hesitant to criticize the Greek coup and the human rights abuses there because they're worried that Greece would somehow pull out of the NATO military command. They're very concerned that Greece will sort of pull a de Gaulle. Mm-hmm. And that even, it's not going over to the other side. It's just the one step back that they're quite concerned about, as you suggest rightly, despite the lack of power in many different respects that Greece has. In the strategic location, certainly, but it is interesting to me how concerned they are about France as the potential model that Greece could
the question there, though, is what is it that the United States fears it may lose? Is it Greece as a strategic piece of territory? Is it Greece as a military power? Or is it Greece as an equal, at least theoretically equal member of the alliance? So I think that question there may help us identify exactly what the source of Greek power in this context is, and the source, conversely, of American fear.
Might be small powers, but the territorial, possessions that they have, in other words, the geostrategic advantages, is crucial. In some ways, it's not the military contribution as such, but the possibility that the military base system of the United States can be, part of that. So I think that's another thing that we have to keep in mind when we talk about these quote unquote small states. And the other thing that came to my mind when we're talking about leadership and partnership is the notion of, Gail Lindestad's idea of an empire by invitation. And then of course you feel free to reject that invitation, which comes as a cost. But in some sense you can, make a leap and designate that as a community of trust as well.
I would I just see two different things here. First of all, I agree with that. Denmark has Greenland, and so it has strategic locations, and Finland has the 800-mile border with the Soviet Union. But for me, there are two different things. I think that there were many countries that were small and of no real consequence in the Cold War. So, Albania can be its own country and be a communist country. It depends. But trust, if there is some kind of trust between the states, then there's a relationship that, even if it's asymmetrical, it has two. I think that's a different thing than being afraid that someone is going to leave or go to the other side. Is a different thing than having a relationship, even if it's asymmetrical, between 2 points. So for me, those two things were a bit different.
Any further comments? Wait for Mike.
Thank you. Just to add something very shortly, since we talked about the symbolic meaning or symbolic political steps here, we shouldn't forget that whatever we think about them, in reality, the two blocks were communities of states that claimed to pursue a certain common, or follow a certain common worldview, pursuing based on common values, pursuing common goals, and the defection or neutralization of some of them would mean that, at least on the surface, the hegemon would no longer convince that partner, and that would have just been a blow to the credibility. I mean, it was, at some level, that competition was there. I mean, there was a time when, in the 50s and 60s, it seemed to many that the two hegemons were equally appealing, and it wasn't yet a clear decision at that time. So they're trying to win over certain countries. I mean, in the third world, it looks different when they have these, what do you call them? These, not real wars, but this kind of proxy wars. Thank you. Yeah. So gaining influence there, but just mean to say, and Europe was always the center of everything. Was the heartland of that conflict. So what happened in Europe? Even the smallest European country, it would have been possible in the Eastern Bloc, obviously, but theoretically, indicating would no longer trust the hegemon, even had no immediate physical consequence. It would have meant a great blow to the symbolic power of that hegemon, to some point. Thanks.
Spend all day on the 5th floor of the Wilson Center, because outside, I can tell you, it was a beautiful day. Very beautiful. Okay, and I also had my 7-year-old son here who already had 6 hours of school, and now I had to spend 90 minutes on the panel, so I think he's also a bit tired now. So I think Martin Klimke has to make some announcements, and otherwise, thank you everybody. Thank you everybody at the panel in particular. It was really a great panel. Thank you very much.
Let me make just a very, very quick technical announcement. Tonight's dinner, and that's somewhat significant, is an invited dinner. So we might not be in Vienna here, so I can't promise any dancing, but we can certainly try to replicate the Helsinki experience in terms of eating and drinking. So just to let you know, beer and wine, soda, coffee is included. Any kind of hard liquor, you're on your own. Yeah.
But that's not in the Helsinki experience.
I know. That might not be the Finnish way. I know. But the German taxpayers way, I assure you. That's what I said. So here are two, there's a set of maps which gives you directions from the institute to the restaurant. It's very close by, maybe 5 or 10 minutes walking distance. Yeah. From your hotel to Rosenberg, just a couple blocks away. All right. So you see you there at 8 o'clock.
The German taxpayer.